Closed for more than 50 years, the old Covington Railroad Station near the intersection of Russell and Pike Streets once stood as a conduit for northern Kentucky travelers during its nearly 40-year run as a large-scale rail transport operation. Despite being dormant and unused, the station retains a remarkable amount of equipment and clues to its rich historic past. The Kenton County Public Library was granted access to explore the old train station's remnants and ruins to discover the station's forgotten days left behind. The city of Covington and owners of the rail company came to realize elevated rail platforms were necessary after a series of gruesome accidents with the trains running at street level. Disrupting traffic and the flow of goods, along with the destruction of property and heavy loss of life and livestock, made the decision to elevate the new station platform inevitable for the local neighborhoods surrounding the new Covington Station. The raised platform and tracks that run nearly a mile through Covington are still present and in use today. Nearly 3 floors above the ground-level entrance to the station, a honeycomb of passenger stairs and freight elevators were needed to operate the Covington Station in its heyday. Northbound, southbound, and middle service freight platforms required their own access points via 13-feet-wide concrete steps and cable-driven lifts that hauled not only luggage, but large amounts of U.S. exports and freight volume. It's estimated today that 1/3 of all exports in the United States and 40% of long-distance freight is moved via rail. Local historian Chris Mayhew explains how those numbers would have been even higher back in the Covington Station's heyday.
Covington Station was a major station. A lot of smaller communities, wouldn't have such a large station because thousands of people came through here on any given day in its heyday, especially the teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. That was the primary mode of travel, and you are connected to the national rail network then and now. You took the Flamingo to go south and go to Jacksonville or somewhere else on the Louisville and Nashville, which ran its trains through here as well. You took the George Washington to go to Washington, D.C., the fast-flying Virginia to get to Charlottesville and other places. You could get anywhere you wanted to go to. You get to San Francisco, you can get to Miami, New York City, right from these tracks here.
The Covington and Lexington Railroad, built from Covington to Lexington shortly before the Civil War. It goes through a number of reorganizations and becomes part of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. In the 1880s, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway reaches Covington and does do the bridge across the river. So they need a station, both the Louisville, Nashville, and the Chesapeake and Ohio. They have, in the 1930s, they raised the on-street grade level to the upper grade level that we now know in Covington, where you drive underneath the railroad tracks. And they built this depot. It's built by the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, but the Louisville and Nashville Railroad is also going to use it. They built this, and since they got it up high, they built it at street level, and they got to put these stairways and elevators to get you up to where the track is. So that's why we wind up with a sort of a strange station that looks more for New York than for Covington. And this is all being funded by the railroad, which is, something you got to think about is the city's always wanted a grandiose passenger station to reflect upon the nature of their town. But the city isn't building it. The railroad's building it. Oh, by the way, Mr. Railroad, after you build the depot, it becomes real estate, and we're going to charge you real estate tax on it. So here you are as the railroad guy, you're trying to decide what sort of depot am I going to build to make the mayor and the city council happy, but it's not going to be so grandiose that it's going to cost me so much money that all my money's going to go into real estate tax.
So right now we're standing in the middle of Covington Station's platform area. It's about 35 to 40 yards long. If you look behind me, you can see one of the platform entrances, so you can see the steps here that would lead to the platform. So you would enter in behind where I'm standing from the main waiting rooms. You would come down this hallway and you would enter the platforms. There's one directly to my right and one directly to my left. One would be heading north, so trains heading north, you would go up one set of stairs. One set of stairs led to trains heading south. This was a very busy station, particularly before and during World War II. Lots of people coming into the station to travel, either on business or for pleasure or visiting family. And so this was a very bustling station. And there were hundreds of people getting off trains here every time a train pulled in, and thousands of people coming through the station every day. So this is a very busy place.
Some of those trains coming through here have up to 20 cars on them. Maybe 4 or 5, 6 head-end cars. Then we got Pullman cars and we got coach cars. We're running trains through here, as I said, you're going to Florida. There's no airplane to take. You're going to take the train to Florida. You're going to New Orleans for the Mardi Gras. You're taking it from here. You're going to Washington, D.C. You're taking the train. You're going to be on the train overnight. Thus, the Pullman to sleep in, the diner to eat in.
You can see some of the original paint is still on the wall, so you can see how they did the stripe effect. There would have been posters along these walls, especially during World War II, that would have been promoting the war effort to buy victory bonds. So this station really shows the history of Covington. And it was really important for the city fathers and for those working in the city and the railroad to showcase Covington. Covington was reaching the peak of its population in the 1930s, 1920s. There would have been almost 60,000 people living in the city at that time period.
We're at street level. The track is some 20, 30 feet above us up here. So to move the stuff up, your luggage of your passengers, the LCL, less than carload stuff, those packages that UPS moves and everything, and your U.S. mail, you had an elevator here to move things up. So these elevators are being used for moving packages and luggage and mail up the upper, and to bring it back down. So this is an important part of this station here. We got to have a baggage car. And we're pulling the baggage car down, turning it, moving it in on this elevator. That's why it's long and deep, to get that baggage car on. This goes up, and then the baggage car is pulled off, pulled up to the head end part of the train to either load or offload. We're moving coffins. You have had somebody die here who came to town, and they're from, I don't know, Atlanta, let's say. They've been treated, put in a casket, and the casket's been brought down and loaded upon the train. This is a fairly common thing that happened. One of the other things we're moving is live animals, not pigs and that, but chickens, dogs, and cats. Smaller animals are being moved this way also onto the baggage car.
You've got 800 feet of concrete that people would have spaced out to catch the train. When passenger trains were running, at the end they were only a couple, 3, 4 cars long. But in the heyday, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, you had sleeper cars, you had lounge cars, you had dining cars, and how many cars were on each train varied, but you would have between 8, 10, 14, even longer sometimes. So at night, it wouldn't be dark. You would have baggage carts and railroad employees coming and going to make sure your baggage got on. And this would be going all day and all night. It wasn't like you had one train going through here a day. You would have multiple, both locals and standard trains, which were, they made stops at almost every station, and then your more first-class trains that only stopped at the really big cities. And Covington was a big city, and most every train stopped here.
Back in the late 1980s, in search of an area to record scenery reminiscent of 1950s Harlem, the Covington Station and an urban area in Cincinnati, roughly 3 miles to the north called Over the Rhine, were chosen by Palace Productions as the site of a new movie. Starring Forrest Whitaker, Danny Glover, Gregory Hines, and Robin Givens, A Rage in Harlem was filmed on location around Cincinnati and for one key scene at the Covington Station. Producers and the director of the movie remarked while making the movie how easy it was to seamlessly transform the local area into a scene from nearly 40 years before. and the Covington Station was no exception. Part of the Covington Station's 40-plus year history includes a dark period in American history, known as the Jim Crow era. Adopted in Kentucky in 1866 and enforced for nearly 100 years, Jim Crow laws forced segregation of the races in schools, government buildings, bus stops, and railroad stations. By state and federal law, railroad stations were forced to provide separate but equal waiting rooms for white and colored passengers. Heavy fines and even mandatory jail sentences were given to the owners and employees of streetcars, bus services, and rail stations if the Jim Crow laws were not enforced. Former station employee Charles Bogart explains what it was like to work under the Jim Crow laws of segregation.
The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway used to run a train from Newport News all the way to Chicago, and from Chicago all the way back to Newport News. So you, the African American, gets on the train in Chicago, sits wherever he wants to, gets to Cincinnati, and I, the conductor, now must walk up to him and say, "Sir, you can't sit in this car anymore. You got to go that car back there." By the way, if he doesn't do it, it isn't the railroad that gets arrested. It's me, the conductor, that gets arrested, fined, and put in jail by the Commonwealth of Kentucky.
So this part of the building, that was the segregated part of the building, was not as comfortable as the rest of the station. And looking around, I see 3 elevator shafts. Each one of these were used to transport materials, baggage, all of those things that needed to go up the level to get loaded onto trains came through this part of the building. They were all steam powered or cold powered depending on the time period, and so this was a very dirty part of the station, very noisy. And so African Americans who were entering and exiting through the segregated entrance behind me, this would not have been as a pleasant of experience as other travelers would have experienced. So here's one example of one of the devices that was used when this station was open. This is a hand cart, so it would have been used to transport luggage and other baggage from the lower level to the concourse level. These were being used throughout the building, particularly in this hallway in this segregated part of the building, because this is where the elevator shafts were located. There are 3 of them along this concourse. They were steam or coal powered depending on the time period in which we're talking about. So this part of the station would have been a little bit dirty, noisy, very crowded. African Americans who were coming in and out of the segregated waiting room would have had to be weaving in and out of the workers that were using these carts. Ironically enough, too, the porters and the folks that were doing a lot of this work were African Americans themselves. And so they kept this train station and the railroad in many ways operating.
Train expert Chris Mayhew joined the Kenton County Public Library on the exploration of the outskirts of the rail station property to search out pieces of the area's past. Clues of the station's former use in the surrounding areas are all over the site and give insight to the station's history as a large rail hub.
What this is the remaining foundation for what was called in railroad lingo OB cabin, but what OB stood for was Ohio Bridge. And the bridge to the Ohio River is just over to our left. It is also the entrance to Covington Station. You would have seen hand-thrown switches up in the tower with the operator receiving telegraph instructions and radio instructions from dispatchers and from the train crews themselves. And they would often hand up orders, paper orders, when the train came by that gave them an idea of what they were supposed to do, not only here, but their next several stops along the line.
So I'm standing in the West Concourse. If you would go up the steps behind me, you would be on the platform that transported people on the southbound lines. It's interesting and somewhat ironic that this building was built in the 1920s when cars were just becoming popular. That development actually led to the abandonment eventually of the Covington Station. Cars became more popular and road construction became more a part of our society. People started being able to afford to purchase cars and started traveling by car. And so railroad usage, especially for passengers, started declining. Roads provided transportation for trucks. And so a lot of the goods that were being moved by rail were moving on to trucks. And so the need for a large station like the one we're standing in here in Covington declined rapidly after World War II.
To learn more about the history of Covington's travel experience and view an extensive collection of area maps and searchable newspaper articles, visit the local History and Genealogy Department at the Covington branch of the Kenton County Public Library, or visit www.kentonlibrary.org/genealogy.